My Uncle Ray died last winter, and out of everything he owned, the only thing nobody in the family wanted was his old fishing boat. It had been sitting in his backyard for at least a decade, propped up on cinder blocks, paint peeling, one window cracked straight through the cabin door. My cousins joked that hauling it to the scrapyard would probably cost more than the boat itself was worth, and honestly, looking at it that first day, I couldn't really argue with them. Ray had been a commercial fisherman most of his life, working out of a small harbor town most people have never heard of, spending decades on the water before his health finally forced him to stop. He never married, never had kids of his own, and toward the end he'd become the kind of relative you saw twice a year if you were lucky, always a little distant, always keeping most of his stories to himself. When the estate got divided up, I offered $500 for the boat, mostly out of pity.
Growing up, Ray was always the uncle who showed up to family gatherings a little late, stayed a little quieter than everyone else, and left before dessert without much explanation. My mother, his younger sister, used to say he'd never really been the same after a rough stretch in his 20s, something involving a business partner and a falling out on the docks that she never fully explained to me even as an adult. He lived alone in a small house not far from the harbor, kept mostly to himself, and spent what free time he had either on the water or tinkering in a cluttered workshop attached to his garage. I remember visiting him exactly twice as a kid, both times finding him elbow-deep in some engine repair, radio playing quietly in the background, barely looking up to acknowledge I was there. Towing the boat back to my own place took most of a Saturday, my truck straining under the weight the whole 2-hour drive, my neighbors giving me curious looks as I backed it awkwardly into my driveway. I remember standing there afterward, hands on my hips, looking at this sad, weathered hull and wondering seriously if I'd made a $500 mistake.
The renovation started slow, mostly me learning as I went, since I'd never actually worked on a boat hull before, beyond basic maintenance on rented pontoons during summer trips years earlier. I brought in a retired marine mechanic named Walt, someone a neighbor recommended, paying him by the hour to help me figure out what was actually salvageable versus what needed to be replaced entirely. Walt took one look at the engine and shook his head, telling me it hadn't run in years and probably wasn't worth saving. But the hull itself, he said, was solid fiberglass over a steel frame, built tougher than most modern recreational boats. We spent the first 2 weekends just stripping out old wiring and rotted interior paneling, hauling bag after bag of debris to the dump, uncovering more of the boat's original structure with each layer we removed. Walt mentioned early on that older commercial fishing boats sometimes had modified compartments built into the hull, extra storage spaces added by fishermen for gear, bait, or sometimes things they didn't necessarily want visible during dock inspections. I hadn't thought much of that comment until the 3rd weekend, when Walt, running his hand along the inside of the hull near the stern, stopped suddenly. Walt ran his flashlight slowly along the section of hull he'd been feeling with his hands, and it only took a few seconds for both of us to notice what he was pointing at. There was a seam in the fiberglass, subtle but definitely not part of the original manufacturing pattern, running roughly 2 feet long near the base of the stern wall. Walt explained that factory fiberglass work had a consistent texture and layering pattern, but this section looked like it had been redone separately, patched over by someone working with more improvised tools rather than proper marine equipment. He tapped along the seam with the handle of a screwdriver, listening carefully, and confirmed that the sound changed noticeably once he crossed past the edge of that patched area. Whatever was behind that section, he said, wasn't part of the boat's structural framework, since a support beam would have sounded solid all the way through, rather than hollow like this did. I remember crouching there next to him, watching him trace the outline with his finger, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of nothing else in my life up to that point. Walt looked over at me and asked if I wanted to.
I told Walt I wasn't waiting until morning, and he laughed, saying that was exactly what he expected me to say before grabbing a small angle grinder from his toolbox. He worked carefully along the edge of the patched seam, cutting slowly so he wouldn't damage whatever was on the other side, sparks occasionally flying off into the dim workshop light. It took him almost 20 minutes to fully cut through the reinforced fiberglass, stopping every few minutes to check his progress and make sure he wasn't cutting too deep into whatever space existed behind it. Once he finally pried the section loose with a flathead screwdriver, a small rectangular panel came away in his hands, revealing a narrow compartment built into the hull that definitely hadn't come from any factory. The space was maybe 8 inches deep and about 2 feet wide, clearly built by hand, lined with what looked like an old rubberized coating meant to keep moisture out. Walt stepped back and let me look first, handing me his flashlight without saying much, both of us sensing this wasn't the moment for jokes anymore. I leaned in close, pointed the beam into the narrow opening, and saw something wrapped tightly in what looked like heavy plastic sheeting, tucked all the way at the back of the compartment.
I reached into the narrow compartment carefully, my fingers brushing against the plastic-wrapped bundle before finally getting a solid enough grip to pull it free. It was heavier than I expected, dense in a way that made my arm drop slightly the moment it cleared the opening. I set it down on a nearby workbench, and Walt leaned in close as I started peeling back layers of plastic sheeting, each layer more brittle than the last from years of sitting sealed inside that hull. Underneath the plastic was a canvas bag, the kind fishermen used decades ago for gear, drawstring pulled tight and knotted at the top. I worked the knot loose, my hands not quite steady, and opened the bag to find several smaller bundles inside, each one wrapped separately in oilcloth. Walt picked one up, testing its weight, and said whatever this was, it clearly wasn't fishing tackle. I unwrapped the first bundle slowly, the oilcloth falling away to reveal stacks of banknotes bound tightly with old rubber bands that snapped apart the moment I touched them. Walt and I just stood there for a long moment, staring at money that looked like it had.
Once we'd counted through all the bundles, laying stacks of old bills across the workbench in neat rows, Walt suggested I stop touching everything with bare hands and start photographing it before we did anything else. I counted 11 separate bundles in total, each one containing what looked like several $1,000s in older denominations, bills I didn't fully recognize from any currency I'd handled in my own lifetime. Tucked into the bottom of the canvas bag, beneath the last bundle, was a small waterproof logbook, the kind fishermen use to track catches and weather conditions during long trips out on the water. I opened it carefully, flipping past pages of ordinary fishing notes before finding several entries near the back, written in a noticeably different tone than the rest. My uncle's handwriting, unmistakable once I compared it to old birthday cards I still had, filled these final pages with short, clipped notes about money owed to him from a fishing partnership that had apparently ended badly sometime in his 20s. Walt read over my shoulder, quiet for once, as I worked through entries mentioning a... The logbook entries described a fishing partnership my uncle had formed in his early 20s with a man named Curtis, the two of them running a small boat together out of the same harbor for several seasons before things fell apart. According to what he'd written, Curtis had handled the business side of their operation, selling their combined catch to local buyers and splitting the profits at the end of each week, an arrangement that apparently worked fine for the first couple of years. Then, based on a series of increasingly frustrated entries, Curtis started shorting him on payments, claiming buyers were paying less than they actually were, skimming a larger share for himself, while my uncle stayed out on the water doing most of the physical work. My uncle never wrote anything about confronting him directly, but the entries made it clear he'd started quietly setting aside a portion of the catch himself, selling small amounts privately to different buyers Curtis never knew about, slowly building this hidden stash as a form of unofficial repayment. Walt pointed out that this kind of quiet dispute wasn't unusual on the docks back then, since taking a partner to court over shady bookkeeping was often more trouble and expense than it was worth for a working fisherman. Reading through page after... Toward the final pages of the logbook, the entries shifted noticeably, no longer focused on the partnership dispute, but instead on what my uncle planned to actually do with the money he'd quietly set aside over those final seasons. He wrote that he never intended to spend it outright, worried that Curtis or anyone else on the docks might notice if he suddenly started living differently on a fisherman's income.
Instead, he described welding a small compartment into the hull himself during a winter when the boat was pulled out of the water for routine repairs, choosing a section near the stern he figured nobody would ever have reason to inspect closely. Walt confirmed this matched what we'd found, explaining that a lot of commercial fishermen from that generation had at least basic welding and fiberglass skills, learned out of necessity rather than any formal training. The last entry in the logbook was dated only a few months after the compartment was sealed, mentioning briefly that he and Curtis had finally stopped fishing together, with no further explanation about how exactly the partnership ended. After that entry, the logbook simply stopped, page after page left blank for the rest of the book.
I sat with the logbook for a long while after Walt finally packed up his tools for the night, rereading those final entries alone in the quiet workshop, trying to picture my uncle at 20-something, angry and careful all at once, welding a hidden compartment into his own boat rather than confronting a partner directly. The next morning, I called my mother, hoping she might remember something about Curtis or the partnership from stories she had overheard decades earlier as a teenager living in the same small harbor town. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, then admitted she vaguely remembered the name, saying their own mother had mentioned once that Ray's fishing partnership ended badly, and he'd never really talked about it afterward. She said the family had always assumed it was simply a falling out between two young men, nothing more serious than a friendship that ran its course under financial pressure. Hearing her repeat that assumption, knowing now what I actually had sitting in a canvas bag on my workbench, felt strange, like I was suddenly holding a piece of family history nobody else had access to anymore. I asked if she remembered anything else about Curtis specifically, a last name, where he might have ended up, and she promised to think about it and ask around among some of her older friends who still lived near the harbor. I hung up the phone that morning with more questions than I'd started the week with, and a growing sense that I needed to understand this story properly before deciding what to actually do.
My mother called back a few days later with more than I expected, having spoken to an old family friend who still lived near the harbor and remembered the fishing community from that era fairly well. Curtis, it turned out, had a last name my mother finally recalled, and according to her friend, he'd left the area entirely sometime in the late 70s, not long after his partnership with my uncle ended. Nobody seemed to know exactly where he'd gone, though there was a vague rumor he'd moved further down the coast to start some kind of boat repair business under a different name. I spent that evening searching online, cross-referencing old business records and local newspaper archives from towns up and down the coastline, hoping to find any trace of a Curtis matching the details my mother had given me. After a couple of hours, I found a short obituary from almost 15 years earlier. A man with the same name and roughly the right age, survived by 2 adult children in a coastal town about 4 hours from where I lived. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, processing the fact that the man from my uncle's logbook had been gone for over a decade already, any chance of hearing his side of the story gone along with him. Still, curious about the children mentioned in the obituary, I decided the next logic.
Tracking down Curtis's children turned out to be easier than I expected, mostly thanks to a couple of public social media profiles that mentioned the same coastal town from the obituary. I messaged the older of the two, a woman named Diane, explaining as clearly as I could that I was Ray's nephew and had recently come across some old fishing records connected to her father and my uncle from decades earlier. She responded within a day, surprisingly open to talking, mentioning that her father had occasionally brought up his early fishing years, though always somewhat vaguely and never in much detail. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop partway between our two towns the following weekend, both of us curious what the other might actually know. Sitting across from her that Saturday morning, I gave her a general outline of what I'd found without going into every detail, watching her expression shift somewhere between surprise and quiet recognition as I spoke. She admitted her father had mentioned once, years before he passed, that he'd made some mistakes early in his career that he regretted, though he never specified exactly what those mistakes were or who they'd affected. Hearing that secondhand acknowledgement decades after the fact from a daughter who clearly still loved her father despite whatever he'd done.
Diane and I talked for almost 2 hours that morning, long after our coffee had gone cold, comparing what little we each knew about our father's partnership in the years that followed it. She mentioned that her father had built a modest but respectable boat repair business after leaving the harbor town where he and my uncle worked together, apparently successful enough to raise 2 kids comfortably, despite whatever financial trouble he might have caused someone else along the way. It was strange sitting there, realizing that whatever Curtis had taken from my uncle decades earlier had likely helped fund a stable, ordinary life for a family that had no idea where that early advantage actually came from. Diane asked carefully, almost hesitantly, whether I was planning to do anything about it now, some kind of legal claim or demand for repayment from her father's estate. I told her honestly that wasn't why I'd reached out, that my uncle himself had never pursued anything formally while he was alive, choosing instead to quietly take back what he felt he was owed, rather than escalate things further. She seemed visibly relieved hearing that, and I understood why, since digging up a decades-old financial dispute involving a father who could no longer defend himself or explain his side clearly wasn't something either of us actually wanted. Before we parted ways that afternoon, she thanked me for reaching out in person rather than through some formal legal chat.
Driving home from that coffee shop, I found myself thinking about my uncle in a completely different light than I had my entire life up to that point. The quiet, distant man I remembered from those rare family gatherings suddenly made a lot more sense. Someone who'd carried a private grievance for nearly 50 decades without ever once mentioning it to anyone in the family. I spent the following week deciding what to actually do with the money itself, eventually taking it to a currency specialist who could tell me more about its actual value beyond just the face amounts printed on the bills. He explained that several of the older denominations were no longer in general circulation, and depending on condition and collector interest, some of the bills were worth more than their original printed value to the right buyer. After his assessment, factoring in both the collectible premium on certain notes and the straightforward value of the rest, the total came out to just under $60,000, considerably less dramatic than some numbers I'd heard about from other people's stories, but life-changing for me all the same. I called Walt that evening to update him, and he laughed, saying he'd half expected me to find something like this the moment he noticed that mismatched seam in the fiberglass. Sitting alone in my kitchen that night, staring at a stack of old bills that had spent nearly 50 years,
I finished restoring the boat over the following 2 months, working alongside Walt on weekends, finally getting the engine running properly and repainting the hull a deep navy blue that looked nothing like the faded wreck sitting on cinder blocks in my uncle's backyard less than a year earlier. I decided to keep it rather than sell it, taking it out on the water myself for the first time on a quiet Saturday morning in early spring, engine humming steadily beneath me in a way that felt strangely emotional, given everything that boat had quietly carried for nearly 50 years. I welded a small brass plate near the stern, close to where the hidden compartment had originally been cut open, engraved simply with my uncle's name and the years he'd spent fishing out of that harbor. It felt like the right way to acknowledge what he'd gone through, without turning it into some dramatic public story that might have embarrassed a man who clearly valued his privacy above almost everything else. I stayed in touch with Diane over the following months as well, the two of us occasionally texting updates, an unexpected connection neither of us saw coming from a conversation that started with old fishing records and a decades-old grievance. Sitting out on the water that first morning, watching the harbor slowly come into view exactly the way it must have looked to my uncle.
People always assume a story like this is really about the money, the hidden compartment, or the decades-old dispute between 2 young fishermen who once trusted each other completely. For me, the real discovery ended up being something quieter than any of that. Buying my uncle's forgotten boat for $500 taught me that the people we think we know best sometimes carry entire chapters of their lives locked away, not out of malice, but simply because they never found a safe way to let anyone else in. My uncle spent nearly 50 years being the quiet, distant relative at family gatherings, and I spent most of my life assuming that was simply who he was, rather than someone shaped by a betrayal he never fully recovered from. I think about him every time I take that boat out now, engine running steady beneath me, brass plate catching the morning light near the stern. He never got the chance to tell his side of the story to anyone in the family while he was alive, but in a strange way, restoring that boat and finally understanding what he went through feels like the closest thing to that conversation I'll ever get to have. Sometimes the most valuable thing someone leaves behind isn't hidden in a hall or wrapped in oilcloth. It's simply the chance, however delayed, to finally understand who they really were.
Before you go, hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable stories just like this one. See you in the next story.